Welcome to Wordpath, a show about the importance of Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are preserving them. Tonight we're going to discuss a very common phenomenon known as linguistic borrowing, or the borrowing of words between different languages. Borrowing is actually sort of a funny word to use because when languages borrow a word, they seldom give it back. In fact, languages simply help themselves to each other's words when speakers find it convenient to do so. The subject of borrowing has come up in many discussions I've had with speakers and teachers of Indian languages. I often hear comments opposing the use of non-Indian words in an Indian language. People will say, for instance, don't call bread tortilla. The real Comanche word for bread is nolcop. Tortilla is a Mexican word. Now, in fact, some Comanches do use the word nolcop for bread. Quite a few do. It's based on a Comanche verb root that means to bake something. But a lot of other Comanches do use the word tortilla in their everyday life, which to me means that in their Comanche, that's an ordinary Comanche word for them, even though we know it really came originally from the Spanish word tortilla. And it's been slightly adapted in pronunciation to match more closely the Comanche patterns of pronunciation. So in Spanish it's tortilla, and in Comanche it's more like tortilla, with an H where the R is in the Spanish. Anyway, apparently a number of Comanches did come to use this word for bread. A lot of present-day Comanches use it because their ancestors had close contact with Spanish speakers from Mexico who used that word, and apparently some other people's Comanche ancestors preferred to use the native Comanche word for baked to describe the new phenomenon of bread. Now remember, there was presumably no generally agreed upon word in Comanche for bread at one point in time because bread, as far as we know, was not a traditional Comanche food. So they weren't exposed to bread before the advent of Europeans and of their European foods. Faced with this new phenomenon of bread, which Comanches wanted to talk about, they basically came up with two solutions for the problem, with some people opting for just using the Spanish word which already existed for a bread-like material, probably the first they encountered, and others opted for the more descriptive term, saying something that's baked. Another common example in Comanche is the word for potato. Some Comanches use the phrase, or the word tzitsina, which is an old Comanche word for an indigenous North American plant, which has an edible tuberous root, very much like the potatoes that you would buy today in the grocery store. On the other hand, some others use the word papas, which is basically an adaptation of the Spanish word papas, which means potatoes. So again, some people tease each other saying, oh, you use papas, that's not a real Comanche word, you shouldn't talk that way. There's only one English food that I know of that's caused an English word to be borrowed into the Comanche language, and that's very marginal. It's kureevi, which is based on the English word gravy. Some people use the term kureevi in Comanche, and again, it's an unfamiliar concept, and so they adapted the word that the people with the concept had. They sort of borrowed the cultural item, the food item, and at the same time borrowed the word for it. Right up to the present day, though, borrowing is partly a matter of taste. Some people, for reasons of ethnic and linguistic pride, prefer to avoid borrowing altogether. Others are comfortable with borrowing words from other languages. But with the present situation of so many Oklahoma Indian languages being on the verge of extinction, some people feel especially strongly that they want to keep what's left of their language as free as possible of outside influence, so as to preserve the most authentic aspects of their language for the coming generations. Tonight I'd like to offer a little broader perspective on the whole subject of linguistic borrowing. We English speakers, of course, also know the word tortilla. We use it for this particular item here, the tortilla in the sense of Mexican Spanish, the way the term is used there. We borrowed that word just to refer to that particular thing and not to other kinds of bread because we already had a perfectly good English word for bread. So we didn't generalize it the way some Comanches have. And after all, we did need to have some kind of name for this thing. Once upon a time, English-speaking Americans didn't really know what a tortilla was, but when they started going to Mexican restaurants and being confronted with tortillas and wanted to ask for them or order them, they wanted to be understood by their waiter, so they had to call them something. They could see that yellow flat thing that we're going to dip in the salsa. Salsa is another borrowing, of course. But we just simply took on the word tortilla and made it part of English, even though it was originally Spanish. So we can now say that it is an English word, even though it's a borrowed word, or a loan word, to use another expression that people use for this type of word, of Spanish origin, that entered the language through borrowing that was encouraged by cultural contact. There's another flat grain item that English borrowed a word for, a French style of wheat-based kind of pastry wrapper that's filled with meats or fruits. We call it a crepe. Now in English it's crêpe, it's pronounced slightly differently, but we first encountered this item probably either from a French chef somewhere along the line in the history of English, or simply from going to French restaurants. And again, we needed a name for it, so we just used the name that already existed. A lot of borrowed words have entered English because of cultural contact, in fact, in restaurants, it seems, or over a meal. Consider other words for other types of bread that we have adopted into English, at least some speakers have. Baguette, chapati, if you go to Indian restaurants. Pita are names for other types of bread borrowed from French, Hindi, and I'm not sure about pita. I think that may be a Hebrew word. I'm not quite, wasn't able to verify the source of that, but it certainly is not an ancient English word. Not to mention all sorts of other names for foods. We have some examples here on the table. This item here, and the mixture using it here is called chocolate in English. You might think that's a perfectly ordinary English word. It doesn't sound foreign in any way. You wouldn't think that would be a borrowing. But in fact, chocolate originally was pronounced tzuculat, and it means bitter water, and it's the Aztec expression for chocolate. And chocolate is a New World plant. And so the Aztec word was borrowed by Spanish speakers in Mexico into the Spanish language as from tzuculat, it became chocolate. And then through Spanish, it was borrowed into other European languages so that we have English chocolate, French chocolat, and so forth. So that's a word that's really made its way around the world. Another word is chili. All sorts of chilies have their linguistic origin, again, in another Aztec word, chili, which refers to peppers. And that got borrowed into Spanish and from there into other languages, European languages, and other languages around the world, undoubtedly. Bananas. You might think banana is a perfectly ordinary English word. It was, according to my dictionary, this was borrowed from Portuguese. And it's thought that Portuguese itself had borrowed the word for banana from some African language, the language of some people that they were trading with in Africa. Tomato. I didn't have a fresh tomato because they're pretty lousy in the markets these days. But I have some canned tomatoes. And actually, this is Contadina brand, and it has a picture of an Italian woman on it. You might think of tomatoes as being very Italian, and they are certainly a hallmark of Italian cooking. But tomatoes also, the word originally came from the Aztec language by way of Spanish and then into other European languages. The Aztec word was tomate. And in Spanish, it's tomate, and then in English, we get tomato. Tapioca. This is an interesting example. This comes from a starchy root plant. The original word tapioca, I wouldn't know how to pronounce it, but according to my dictionary, it comes from the Tupi and Guarani languages, which are spoken in the Amazon basin in South America. And they were borrowed, that word was probably borrowed through either Spanish or Portuguese or both, and made its way into European languages. And this is an interesting case, again, like chocolate, of a word that's really made its way around the world, because this one I happen to have bought in an international market and has a label with Thai characters on it. So I don't know how to pronounce the name in Thailand, but I'll bet you it's probably based on the same indigenous word from South America. What else do we have? We have yogurt. Yogurt, the word originally comes from Turkish, and it's now used in French and English and lots of languages. I guess wherever yogurt is eaten, there would be a high tendency for them to use that same word. It's become rather international. And avocados, we're back to the Aztec again. The name for this fruit, which is indigenous to Mexico, in Aztec is aguacat. It ends in a TL sound that doesn't exist in too many languages, certainly not in Spanish. So when the Spaniards adopted this name from the Aztecs, they adapted it a little bit and put a TE on the end instead of a TL, so they say aguacate. And we changed it a little bit more when we borrowed it into English so that now it's avocado. Still other words relating to foods that we have borrowed, we English speakers I mean, would include things like burrito and tamale, again from Spanish, and tamale is from Spanish, but before that was from Aztec. It's amazing how much the Aztecs have contributed to words in international cuisine. Yogurt I mentioned, kiwi, how about kiwi fruit? I had trouble tracing this one down too. I know there's a kiwi bird in New Zealand, and that word is originally Maori, which is an indigenous tribe in New Zealand. I'm not sure if the kiwi fruit has the same source. I would imagine so because I know they're also from New Zealand. Wiener Schnitzel, to give a nice German example. Borscht from, my dictionary says Little Russian. I guess it's some version of Russian. goulash from Hungarian, wontons from Chinese, gumbo from a Central African language, I'm not sure which one, sushi from Japanese. All of these we think to one degree or another are kind of English words nowadays, but originally they were not. Abalone is from Costanoan, which is a North American Indian language of California, and pemmican was borrowed from Cree. Speaking of things like avocados and pemmican, don't forget that borrowing also takes place from Native American languages into English and other European languages. It doesn't always go from European into Native American. So some words that have been borrowed from Native American languages include abalone from Costanoan, several animal names like raccoon and skunk, which come from Algonquian. The word moccasin also is a word for shoe from an Algonquian language. Igloo from some Eskimo language, I believe. I'm not sure if it was Yupik or what. Tobacco comes from a language called Taino from Latin America. We already talked about the tomatoes and chilies. Some of the major contributions of the New World to international cuisine are tomatoes, chilies, maize or corn, and chocolate. And all of these have their linguistic roots. The names that have traveled around the world, in most cases, have their linguistic roots in the New World, just as the plant has its roots in the New World. A lot of place names in what is now the United States were originally Native American also. We could name just dozens and dozens of these, but I'll give you a brief sampling. Tuscahoma is a Choctaw word meaning red warrior, and Tuscaloosa is a Choctaw word meaning, or phrase meaning black warrior or dark warrior. There are obvious names like Honolulu, which must be from Hawaiian. Talihina in Oklahoma means railroad, literally, I think it's steel road or something like that, but it's the term for railroad in Choctaw. Dakota, as in North or South Dakota, is the Dakota people's name for themselves in their own language. And the Oklahoma town Anadarko is from Caddo, and it means something like bumblebee place. Nowata is from the Delaware word that means welcome. Owasso, also in Oklahoma, is basically the Osage word for terminus. It means the end of something, and apparently there was a terminus of the railroad there, and so Owasso got its name from the Osage for that reason. Tishomingo is the name of a Chickasaw chief after whom a town was named. Tulsa is from Creek, and Wewoka is from Creek. And of course the name Oklahoma itself for the territory and later the state means red people in Choctaw. And we've borrowed words in many other areas of our vocabulary, not just food words. For instance, when we talk about futon mattresses, we're borrowing a word from Japanese, the futon. I think in Japanese it sounds more like futon, so we changed it a little bit. Kangaroos are from Australia, and the word kangaroo comes from one of the indigenous languages there. And coyotes, like our friend up here, he also has his roots in the Aztec language. The original word was coyote, which was borrowed into Spanish as coyote and into English as either coyote, 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 depending on which part of the United States you're in. You'll find different pronunciations in the English there. Some of the commonest areas of borrowed words are what are called ethnonyms, which means names for people. So when people are exploring or conquering or whatever and they encounter a new people, they try to find out what these people are called, and usually the answer they'll get back when they're inquiring about people that they're unfamiliar with very, very often will be that people's name for themselves in their own language. Sometimes that will be adopted, and sometimes the conquerors, and this depends on social attitudes too, sometimes they'll make up their own names, quite insulting at times. But many of our ethnonyms are borrowed words. An example is in Ponca, I've heard two pronunciations, either Hispayun or Shpayun is the word for Spaniard. I don't know if it's Mexicans or Spaniards, but it's clearly borrowing from the Spanish word Español, coming out Hispayun or Shpayun. The English word haole, this is only in the English of people who live in Hawaii, I think, or a few other people who happen to be in the know. But there is, in some people's English, they use the word haole, which refers to white people as opposed to native Hawaiians, and that's originally a Hawaiian word. Styles of clothing also give us some borrowings. For instance, pajamas. The word pajama comes from Hindi, and before that it was a Persian word that the Hindi speakers borrowed. Then we have interesting hats, beret. In French, we just call them berets, I guess. In English, we change the pronunciation to make it sound a little more English-like. And then we have muumuu dresses, and in addition to clothing, we have plant and animal names. Often when a people encounter a new animal, they'll ask the people who are indigenous to that area, what's that thing called? And then they'll get answers like raccoon or skunk, and they hear these unfamiliar names, and in many cases will adopt them because they have no name of their own for an animal, of course, that they've never seen. And sometimes commercial and agricultural products introduced through trade will give rise to borrowings too, like wheat in an indigenous language of California called Kitanamuk is pronounced tarigua, and it's based on the Spanish word trigo, because apparently they first traded for wheat from Spanish-speaking people. And then you have all sorts of brand names like Coca-Cola and McDonald's that, I mean, you could sort of say they're English words, they're English brand names really, and they've made it around the world. And people who speak many different languages now know those words as well. Of course, Native American languages have borrowed many words from European languages. Examples from Caddo are the place name Nasunda, which refers to what in English we call Fort Cobb. Nasunda means the soldier place, or in other words, it's calling it fort, basically. And it's based, na is just a place name prefix. It means we're talking about a place here. The Sunda part is the Caddo adaptation of the French word soldat, which means soldier. So Nasunda means Fort Cobb, or it could be any fort, but in fact it's the place name for Fort Cobb. And so that's basically a borrowing from French. Also in Caddo, Inknishi means a white person, and that seems to be a borrowing from the English word English. So when they're talking about white people, in a way, historically they're saying English people, but they've generalized that to refer to white people. And in Caddo there's a similar word to the Panca for Mexicans. They say Español, and that's clearly a borrowing from the Spanish Español. In some cases, the advent of new domesticated animals is marked in the language with the borrowed word. So for instance, the words for cow in a number of languages are based on Spanish vaca. So we get words like walk and walk in Cherokee, walk, I think it's Choctaw, walk, almost the same word in Cherokee means cow. And there's clearly a connection here with the Spanish word vaca. Probably the first people that introduced cows to a number of tribes were Spanish speakers, and they said, you know, what is that thing? And they said vaca, and they sort of adapted that to their own pronunciation and their own language and came out with a similar sounding word. There are also words in a number of languages based on English pussy, as in pussycat. So in Ponca, the word for cat is pussy, and in Creek, it's posy. And there are other languages which have borrowed words based on Spanish gato for cat. There were no domesticated cats, as far as we know, in North America before Europeans came around. Sometimes borrowings are so old or adapted to their host language that they don't even seem like visitors to the language anymore because they don't have a foreign sound anymore. The word pihura in Comanche is an example of this. A lot of Comanches who know in an instant that tortilla is historically a Spanish word, or that papas for potatoes is a Spanish word, may not realize that pihura is a Spanish word too, and it's a borrowing, an adapted borrowing from the word frijol. Now, this is kind of an interesting case because it shows how a language can adapt a word to make it so that they'll be more comfortable pronouncing it. If it has very foreign sounds, they're going to have to change it a little bit in order to adopt it into their language. Now, the Spanish word for beans, frijol or frijoles, they don't always use the plural in Spanish the way we do in English, but frijol starts with this consonant combination FR together, which never exists in Comanche. In fact, there are very, very few consonant clusters like that in the Comanche language. So you would expect that might be simplified somewhat. Comanche also has no sound F. So the beginning of frijol turned out to be just P, P-I, they spell it in Comanche, pihura. So F-R-I of Spanish became P-I of Comanche because there were foreign sounds that needed to be kind of gotten rid of or adapted. And then the in the Spanish word, as in frijol, if I can say that without spitting too much, that exact sound doesn't exist in Comanche just as it doesn't in English. So they do what we often do with words with that sound. They just substitute an H because that's pretty close to the same sound. So we've gotten now to pijoles, which is a little different from the Spanish already. And there's no L in Comanche, so for the L they substitute an R. So frijol has become pihor. For some reason, the O changed to a U also. The vowel changed a little bit. And a vowel was added on the end of the Comanche word because Comanche words never end in a consonant like R. So a number of adaptations happened. And it was apparently borrowed so long ago and so well adapted into the Comanche language that now it looks and sounds just like any other Comanche word. There's nothing unusual about it that would give a clue that this word was borrowed from Spanish originally. Some more examples on the set here, some of our props that might surprise you are tea. Now this can here says Twinings, or is it Twinnings, whatever it is, English breakfast tea. It may be English breakfast tea, but tea is historically a Chinese product, an Asian product. And there are apparently, I was reading about this in the dictionary today, there are two kind of base words for tea that have made their way around the world with the tea trade. And tea was first introduced to Europe in the 17th century. And a lot of languages have adopted a form that sounds something like tea or te or tai. And some other languages adopted a different word from a different Chinese language, they think, which sounds more like cha or tsa. And there are some American Indian languages which have sa as a word for tea also. Another example we have here, where's my sugar? I had a little sugar packet somewhere. Anyway, the word sugar originally came from the Arabic language, and it's been borrowed into languages all over the world. In Spanish, it was borrowed along with a prefix, and it was pronounced azúcar. In English and French and a number of other European languages, it starts just with the S sound. So we have sugar and sucre and things like that. Another really interesting food word that's really made its way around the world is the word for coffee. Now, we all know coffee, and it seems like the most American thing in the world. I happen to think it's the national drink. But originally, the word coffee comes from an Arabic word. I'm going to try to pronounce it something like ahwa, which meant coffee. And that was borrowed from Arabic into Turkey as, maybe it was kahve or something like that. It was also borrowed into Swahili as kahawa. It made its way from Turkish into various European languages. One dictionary I was reading today thinks that it basically came in, the door was Italian, that it was borrowed from Italian into other European languages. In Italian, it's pronounced something like café. In French, café. In Spanish, café. In English, coffee. In Swedish, coffee. And then from some of these European languages, it's not always possible to tell which one, but from somewhere, one of these, undoubtedly, it was borrowed into Caddo as the word kahpi, probably borrowed either from Spanish or French, and into Cherokee as kau. So it's just amazing how borrowed words can make their way all the way around the world. One more example is the word for vanilla, as in vanilla extract. I brought a bottle here that I thought was interesting because it's a Mexican vanilla extract. It says vainilla de papantla, which illustrates the Spanish word vainilla. And that's actually a Spanish word, not borrowed from Aztec, oddly. Just a Spanish word that means something like a sheath or a little enclosed thing or a little pod, like a seed pod. And in fact, the vanilla plant has pods with seeds in it, and it's from the pods that we get that flavoring. So vainilla in Spanish became vanilla in English, and vanille in French, and so forth. Now, most of us recognize some of the more obvious borrowings because they still sound a little foreign to us. Expressions like savoir-faire, a lot of people know that that's French. But some of us don't know that a perfectly English-sounding word like nice also was originally a French word. It was just borrowed so long ago, and we're so accustomed to it that we have no more consciousness of it being a borrowing, but it is. And most of us know that macho is a word borrowed into English from Spanish, but some of us might not recognize that a sort of common American English slang word, juzgado, for a jail, is also borrowed from Spanish from the word juzgado, which means court or jail, courthouse or jail, something like that. And most Comanches know, as I was saying, know that tortilla is from Spanish, but they may not recognize that pijura is from frijol or frijoles. So borrowing just happens all over the place. It seems to be a really natural human impulse to use each other's words for things if you don't already have a word for it, or if there's something unusual about the other culture's particular variety of the thing, a particular variety of bread or whatever it might be. English has borrowed so many words in the last several hundred years that some linguists have estimated that 3/5 of our 20,000 word vocabulary is actually borrowed words. In other words, a very healthy majority of the words that you would find in an English dictionary are not originally English words or Anglo-Saxon. They weren't derived from the ancestral languages, but instead borrowed in from other languages. The vast majority were borrowed from European languages, French, Latin, sometimes Greek, but quite a few were borrowed from American Indian languages, from Hindi, and just from all over, Chinese and so forth. Yet really when it comes right down to it, even a language like English, which has borrowed so many words, it really hasn't changed itself that much. The borrowing of words is really a fairly small matter to a language. In spite of all of our borrowings in English, English is still unmistakably English. We wouldn't mistake it for French or Spanish or Latin or Greek. No one would. The Comanches who call potatoes papas are still undeniably speaking Comanche. The essence of a language is more in its grammar than in its vocabulary. Borrowing is very common all over the world. It seems to be a natural human impulse. So it isn't surprising that there are also examples of borrowings between Indian languages. Comanche wasape and Ponca washabe are such similar words for bear that we must conclude that at some point in the history of these tribes, one language borrowed the word from the other. Similarly with the Comanche word wasa, which means purse or bag, and the Iowa or Bajoje word wasa, which means sack. The Caddo word for Cheyenne people, sianavo, is a borrowing of the Comanche expression sia navo, which means painted feather. So, the next time someone tells you that's not the real word for that, or we don't have a word for that in our language, remember that the line between a borrowed word and a foreign word is often a fuzzy one, and that borrowed words are a lot more common in every language than many people think. See you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene,